Good morning. Title of the sermon is Deepening Our Understanding of Who We Are, Benjamin Franklin. 2 years ago, I started something that I think has become a pattern or tradition perhaps, of taking the 4th of July Sunday and focusing on our history, on persons who, because of their gifts and their graces and their faith and the way they live their lives, they affected our country and who we are in profound ways. I guess you could say, had they not lived, we would not be who we are. And so 2 years ago, we looked at Abraham Lincoln and his life and his beliefs and his faith. And we looked at George Washington last year. Well, today we're going to look at Benjamin Franklin on this 4th of July Sunday. So there are a number of wonderful biographies about Benjamin Franklin. Also, he wrote his own autobiography, which is an amazing book. Walter Isaacson's and Edmund Morgan's and Thomas Kidd's are the three that I have read that will shape some of the things that I share, or much of what I share today. So I want to begin, however, with a story, okay? I was walking across a bridge one day and I saw a man standing on the edge about to jump off. So I ran over and I said, "Stop, don't do it." "Why shouldn't I?" he said. I said, "Well, you've got so much to live for." He said, "Like what?" And I said, "Well, God loves you." "Do you believe in God?" He says, "Yeah, I believe in God." I said, "Are you very religious?" He said, "Yeah, I'm religious. I'm not an atheist." Well, I said, "Me too." I said, Are you a Christian or some other religion?" He said, I'm a Christian." I said, "Me too. Are you Catholic or Protestant?" He said, "I'm Protestant." I said, "Me too. What denomination are you?" He said, "I'm Baptist." I said, "Wow, me too." I said, "Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" He said, "Northern Baptist." I said, "Me too." "Are you premillennialist or postmillennialist?" He said, "Premillennialist." I said, "Me too." I said, "Are you Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? He replied, "Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I said, "Die, heretic," and I pushed him off the bridge. Benjamin Franklin would have liked that story / joke. By the way, it definitely is just a made-up story. But that was his concern about religion, and specifically about Christianity, that he wrestled with his whole life. And many of the things that he did in the way he lived out his faith came out of his concern about the doctrinal dynamics and how often churches have been divided and have fought, even had wars over differences of what we believe, even though when it comes to the values of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the way we are to live, those things are generally agreed upon. What I want to do is just there's so much to Benjamin Franklin that you almost have to walk through his life. And so we're going to quickly walk through his life. He was born in 1706 in Boston, born into a very devout Congregationalist family, Puritan family. In fact, in his earliest years, both his family and he himself thought about him becoming a minister. At the age of 10, after only 2 years of formal education, his formal education came to an end. But he was very much self-taught. At the age of 12, in 1718, he became apprentice to his brother James, who was a printer. And printing, which was not just the mechanics of printing, which was really publishing and writing, would be at the center of his entire life. In 1720, at the age of 14, he stopped going to church. It was a very intentional decision. I mentioned, the doctrinal parts of the faith which dominated the church, very much his Puritan Congregationalist church in Boston. And he used that time to read, to self-educate. At the age of 15, he began to self-identify as a deist. You often hear the terms theist and deist. Theist generally refers to what most of us identify ourselves as persons who believe in a God who created all that is, but also is involved very much in the world and in our lives. Deists believe, sometimes described as a clockmaker God, a God who creates all that is, kind of like creating a clock, and winds it up and then just lets it run out and doesn't really have an ongoing involvement. So I identified as a deist, but the teachings and the values of Jesus were incredibly important to him, particularly the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule became the rubric through which he looked at most of life and most of what he thought to be right or of God. And so doing to others as you would have others doing to you, those words of Jesus became central to him. Along with love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The idea of getting along with people that are different was important to him throughout his life. And finally, the parable of the Good Samaritan would also be very much at the top of the list, and the way we are to care for one another. At the age of 16, he becomes a vegetarian. He doesn't really like the taste of meat. He doesn't like the idea of killing. And he's very frugal, which I appreciate. Meat was expensive. At the age of 17, he runs away to Philadelphia. We're going to talk more about that. It was not a random choice. He wanted to go to Philadelphia because Philadelphia was a place that had a great deal of freedom, both in terms of ideas, but also in terms of the church. We'll talk about that a little later. In many ways, he would remain connected with Philadelphia for the rest of his life. At the age of 18, he was working for a printer in Philadelphia, and he gets sent to London to purchase equipment. And he gets stuck there for 2 years. He doesn't have the money to get back, and he finally gets back after 2 years later. He returns back to Philadelphia in 1726 at the age of 20. At the age of 21, he establishes a group known as the Junto. It was a society of young men who meet for self-improvement, study, mutual support, and fellowship. This was an idea that he had. The idea of people coming together and sharing and supporting each other, studying together, improving themselves and also their community, was out of the mind of Benjamin Franklin. In 1728, at the age of 22, he has an affair that produces an illegitimate son, William, born in 1729. Franklin would struggle with chastity, with fidelity throughout his entire life. This was the first of many affairs that he had. It was the part of his faith that he openly struggled with. If you read his autobiography, he talks about that struggle. In 1729, at the age of 23, he purchases the Philadelphia Gazette, that publication, that newspaper, and he also becomes the official printer for Pennsylvania at the age of 23. At the age of 24, he marries Deborah Reed Rogers. They would remain married for many, many years. In fact, the rest of her life. But it was not a very good marriage. Much of the time he was away, and again, he was not particularly faithful in his marriage in many ways. So that was when he was 24. Now, something else happened in 1924 that really affected him. There's a huge fire in Philadelphia, and it burns up a big part of the town, just devastates the community. And there's nothing there to initiate the rebuilding, and so it takes a long time for Philadelphia to rebuild. Well, this gets him thinking. There's something missing. What if there were organizations in a community that could respond to different sorts of needs? And that led to Franklin essentially developing the concept of nonprofit entities, nonprofit organizations. The first one, and he's celebrated for this, was he comes up with the idea of a public library. I mean, he loves reading, he loves learning, plus he's a printer. It makes sense, right? And so the Philadelphia Public Library he helps establish and found. In 1736, again, thinking about that fire, the first volunteer fire department is created, again, because of Franklin. In 1743, now there were colleges, but almost all of them were established by churches. And he thought they were great, but the first community college, the Academy of Philadelphia, was founded essentially by Franklin, 1743. In 1751, the first public nonprofit hospital, Philadelphia Hospital, again, Franklin, his inspiration. I mean, he was a force in Philadelphia. 1752, his response to that fire, not just the volunteer fire department, but the idea of insurance. Yeah. Benjamin Franklin invented the idea of insurance or prepaid insurance where people pay in, and then when there's a catastrophe, like a huge fire, there are funds to rebuild. Yeah, out of the mind of Benjamin Franklin. In 1731, he becomes a Freemason and would remain so for the rest of his life. He believed in community fellowship, fraternal organizations. He wanted many of them. He wasn't just like the Masons are the only ones. He wanted a proliferation of groups like that. At the age of 27, 1733, he begins to, he's the best known writer, publisher in Philadelphia and actually in all of Pennsylvania. And he begins to write articles opposing taxation without representation when the British Parliament extends the Molasses Act, which was a tax on molasses. He said, we're getting taxed, but we don't have any say in this. It was the beginning of something. That's right. Started with Franklin. 1736, at the age of 30, he's elected and he's named the clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. At the age of 30, he also, and this is something I didn't know at all about, he published a treaty of friendship held with chiefs of the Six Nations at Philadelphia. He gathered together with Native American chiefs, and he realized that there was a brokenness there. And not that this treaty was the resolution to that, but it was an effort that he began to make, again, sort of like the parable of the Good Samaritan. We need to care for one another. And one of the first persons to recognize that with Native Americans. Now, 1739, at the age of 33, was a significant turning point for him. He really didn't have much connection with the church and the Christian faith, but then George Whitefield came to the United States and came to Philadelphia. Whitefield was this, at that time, probably the best known preacher in the world, in the English-speaking world. He was out of the Methodist renewal movement. He had worked with John Wesley, and he comes, and he's an amazing preacher. And this bond forms between Franklin and Whitefield that would continue for the rest of Whitefield's life until he died about 35 years later. Franklin is drawn to the Methodist emphasis on faith lived out. I mean, that just speaks to him. And the idea that that's such an important part of the faith resonates with his understanding of the Golden Rule. At the same time, he loves Whitefield's preaching on the way we have to live out our faith in the world. At the same time, he struggles with the doctrinal aspects of Whitefield's preaching. The idea of what you have to believe and why you have to believe, and those were things that he didn't resonate. But what he found was that he could be in this deep connection with Whitefield, and he was, and remains so, even though they didn't agree on everything. And that was exciting to him. Here was a person that he didn't agree with, and vice versa, and they remained incredibly close friends. In 1740, at the age of 34, Franklin prints all of Whitefield's pamphlets. Now, Whitefield was a force, literally brought the Great Awakening to the colonies, to the American colonies. In the 1740s, Franklin the inventor and the entrepreneur begins to unfold. 1741, he creates the Franklin stove, develops it and markets it. It's vastly more efficient to heat homes. and it becomes a huge success. 1746, he begins his experiments with electricity. And early experience, some of the first experiments with electricity were done by Franklin. In 1751, after 5 years of working with electricity, his work is published in London. And he explodes onto sort of the scientific world stage. And the next year he does his kite experiments. That's a true story. It's not a made-up story, where he came to realize or prove that lightning and electricity were the same thing. Out of that same year, he developed the invention for the lightning rod. The lightning rod was incredibly important invention, prevented literally hundreds and hundreds of buildings from burning down every year, and especially churches, by the way, because they were usually the tallest building. So in 1752, at the age of 46, Franklin has become the best known person in the world. It's hard to believe, but yes, his science and his being a thinker and being an innovator, and he was beloved not only here in the United States, but also especially in England. In 1753, he has ideas about needing a postal service and improving it. He becomes the postmaster for Pennsylvania. In 1754, he proposes, he's one of the very first to propose the colonies, which were kind of fiercely independent, of forming a colonial union, of coming together and together thinking as a union instead of just as separate colonies. They really didn't have a concept of themselves as a single entity. They were separate entities. From 1764, it's a few years later, but it came out of this colonial union, to 1775, right before the Revolution, Franklin goes to England most of that time as the colonial agent for first Pennsylvania, but then others. He's the best known person in the world. And he is amazingly gifted at building relationships and forcing relationships and being a diplomat. And that's what he does for Pennsylvania, for Massachusetts, for Georgia, to New Jersey, and in some ways for all of the colonies. And he does that for over 10 years. During that time, he actually sort of keeps the colonies out of war, because had they gone into war at that time, they would have been annihilated. In 1775, Franklin returns from England just as the war is beginning. And Franklin is the editor of the committee of the 5 that writes the Declaration of Independence. And so he's at the center of that. Now, he was not the main source of that. Jefferson wrote a great deal of it, but he was the editor and contributed to it. He actually was sick during that year, and so not as active as he probably would have been. From 1776 to 1785, Franklin goes to France, and he becomes the principal American diplomat, the ambassador to France. And he's largely responsible for securing France as a Revolutionary War ally. You take Franklin out of the equation, France is not our ally. France is not our ally, almost certainly the war goes the other way. The culmination of that was in 1778, where he essentially negotiated and wrote the terms of the Treaty of Alliance with France. Following the war in 1779 to 1781, Franklin negotiates the peace treaty with England as the war comes to an end. He never stopped inventing. In 1784, at the age of 78, he was one of the oldest he was the oldest signer of the Declaration of Independence. At the age of 78, he invents bifocals. You know why he invented bifocals? He needed them. There he is, 1787. He's the oldest signer also of the U.S. Constitution, which is ratified 2 years later. In 1789, he has become an abolitionist, and he writes an anti-slavery treatise. He changed over time. He was not an abolitionist in his earlier years, but toward the end of his life, a strong opponent of slavery. He dies in 1790 at the age of 84 and has one of the biggest funerals this country had ever had up to that point. 20,000 people attend. The following year, after his death, the Bill of Rights is ratified. We're going to come back to that. All right, so that's walking through his life. So here are the big pieces of Franklin. These are the things that changed our country and really changed the world. The printer-publisher. Poor Richard's Almanac was his vehicle that he started in 1733. He was a huge proponent of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, promoter of free exchange of ideas. He strongly believed you learn more from people you disagree with than people you agree with. And so he always wanted to create dialogue his entire life. He was a promoter of churches, multiple. He wanted there to be a whole lot of different churches and different ideas. That was part of that freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And he's also a promoter of a secular community organizations. He didn't want the church to control everything. Not because he despised or hated the church. In fact, he affirmed, we'll look a little bit more, he supported many, many, many churches. But he felt that churches often felt the need to greatly limit expression. And so there needed to be secular community organizations. Of course, his major inventions: lightning rod, Franklin stove, bifocal glasses, swim fins. Maybe you already know that. Urinary catheter. That's a pretty important one. And then there's the civic institutions. Essentially, Benjamin Franklin creates the nonprofit. By the way, the nonprofit includes the church. That's the model that churches in the United States became a part of. But it begins with public libraries, nonprofit hospitals, public colleges, volunteer fire departments, the whole concept of insurance. And in a sense, he's the founder of what became the U.S. Postal Service. And finally, he's a political leader. He's one of the earliest champions of democracy, the originator of the colonial union. He is this amazing diplomat, first keeping us out of war with Britain when we would have been annihilated, and then finally pulling France as an ally during the war. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a signer of the Constitution. And even though the Bill of Rights was ratified after he died, he is profoundly involved in the first of those. And so the last part of the sermon, I want to focus on church and state, because this is where I believe Franklin makes the greatest contribution. Now, Franklin had a reason why he wanted the church and the state to be separate. He talked about this in many, many different ways, starting early on. Franklin's main reason for why the church and the government should be kept separate is it results in a better church and a better government. Yeah. It makes both better when they're independent, when one doesn't control the other, or vice versa. And that's where the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, has Benjamin Franklin's ideas all over it. The First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Many would say that the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is the most important single entity that has guided this country. It's allowed that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and also freedom of religion. Now, often that separation of church and state, we often look to James Madison. His quote: "Religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together." Interesting, very similar to what Franklin said many, many years earlier. And the whole concept of the separation between church and state, first said by Jefferson all the way much later, 1808, erecting the wall of separation between the church and the state is absolutely essential for a free society. But it was Franklin who really was way before Madison and Jefferson. It was Franklin who had this idea about how important this was. He's one of the earliest proponents of the separation of church and state. Among the founders, he is the earliest. He's also the strongest voice. But it's more than that. It's not just the separation. It was a particular type of separation. He was an advocate for the Pennsylvania model. Okay. There were 13 colonies. And Massachusetts actually includes the whole northern part, what is now Maine and New Hampshire. Well, not New Hampshire, but Maine. I got to get I remember all that it contained. Anyway, that was where he was from. That was controlled by the Puritans. And he goes to Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania wasn't just in the middle, it was different. The 13 colonies, every single colony had an established church. I mean, this was the model, the only model the world knew. Every country in the world had an established church. There was this idea that the church and the government, the church and the state could be separate. This made no sense. No one had ever really thought about that. And so guess what happens in the colonies? All the colonies establish a church. One church that is supported by the state. It's usually the only church that's allowed. No other churches are allowed. And because it's the right one, right? So Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut are all the Congregational church. Now, Rhode Island's a little different. It was broader, but it was all Protestant. New York, Anglican and Episcopal church, or the Episcopal church. New Jersey, everyone but the Catholics. Delaware, everyone but the Catholics. Maryland, Anglican, Episcopal, and actually, eventually, the Catholic Church became very significant there. And the rest of them were Anglican and Episcopal. There was one exception, and that was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. He got a land grant and from the crown, and you got a land grant. You got the land, and you almost always, especially because he was a strong Quaker, the idea was he was going to establish a Quaker colony. But he didn't. He didn't. William Penn has this radical idea. What if we create a colony that, regardless of what religion you are, you can worship freely? And not only that, we are not going to support the Quaker church. We're not going to support any church. Churches are going to have to support themselves. It was this incredible idea. Well, guess who loved this idea probably more than anyone, maybe even more than William Penn himself? Franklin. That was the thing he hated about the church, that it shut down other ideas. You had to be a Congregationalist if you were living in Boston, or nothing at all for the most part. And he didn't like that. And so in Pennsylvania, they set up this open model. And guess what? It flourished. And so there were dozens and dozens and dozens of different churches. There was freedom. There were even Jewish synagogues. So that's the model. So when you hear about the separation of church and state, by the way, Jefferson and Madison, they didn't really have much to say about the church not supporting an established church. They left that. In fact, established churches continued. But Franklin was always pushing for the Pennsylvania model, and that there would be no one church. In fact, he advocated the number 3. He opposed the European model of a support coming from the state. See, that's what existed in all the other colonies except for Pennsylvania. Here's what he wrote about and what he did. Benjamin Franklin, writing about the proliferation of churches in his beloved city of Philadelphia. New places of worship were continually wanted and generally erected by voluntary contribution. My donation for such purposes, whatever might be the sect, was never refused. By the way, he's very generous to almost every church. And this is the reason why. He says, when a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it, 'tis a sign, I apprehend, of it being a bad one. He believed that churches that were successful in doing things that people believed in and felt good about, they would support. And guess what? If they didn't feel good about it and they pulled their support and that church went out of business, that was okay. That wasn't a bad thing. That was a good thing. The strongest, the ones that allowed people to feel best about their faith and their church, those are the ones that survived. This was a radical idea. There was no passing of the offering plate for the most part in churches throughout the colonies, except in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And so when you look at these three things, you realize that Franklin is unique. He not only is the earliest proponent of the separation of church and state among all the founders, he advocates for this Pennsylvania model. And he opposes the European state church model for support of clergy. Now, by the way, the support, that didn't go away until 1833. The last minister got their paycheck from the state in 1833. It took a while. But in essence, what you find, particularly in the First Amendment of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, is this Pennsylvania model. That's the one. Of all the 13 colonies, it's the Pennsylvania model. Jefferson's not from Pennsylvania. Madison's not from Pennsylvania. But guess who is? Franklin. Because he believed deeply that when a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself and God does not take care to support it, 'tis a sign I apprehend of it being a bad one. So of all the models, we end up with the Pennsylvania model becoming the model, essentially, that gets put in place for the United States. And without a doubt, if you take Franklin out of the equation, we would live in a very different country. I think the first of the Bill of Rights would be a very different worded entity. It's because of Franklin and his understanding of faith and the way life is to be lived out, and the fact that churches almost never agree on doctrines, but we often agree on the values of how we are to treat one another. That's what made sense for him. And so, again, his main idea for why the church and the state should be kept separate, it results in a better church. We're a better church because of Franklin, and a better government because of Franklin. I think sometimes we forget this lesson. And this might be one of those times we need to be reminded of what was so clear to him. There's a tradition of communion that when we think of the bread and the cup, we think about not just our relationship with God, but we deeply think about our relationships with one another. And that was the part of the faith that so captivated Franklin. And so as we share in communion this day, we remind ourselves of our connection, not only with one another in what we call a church, but our connection with one another on this 4th of July as members of this country, of this society, and our caring for each other. And the ways we do that affects the whole body, the whole loaf. On the night in which Jesus gave himself up for us, he took bread. And after giving thanks, he broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples. And he said, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And when the supper was over, he took the cup. And after giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples and said, "Drink from this, all of you. This cup is my blood of a new covenant, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sin. Do this as often as you partake of it in remembrance of me." I invite you to share in the bread and the cup at this time. Oh Lord, on this 4th of July Sunday, we thank you for the ways that you seek to be bound together with us that when we talk about communion, it is a communion that includes you. But on this day, we are also reminded it is a communion that must include one another as well. Thank you for the spirit and the faith and the theology and the passion of Benjamin Franklin. May we seek to live out our lives in community with our brothers and our sisters as he did. In the name of Jesus, amen.